While known to many from the most affected areas, the 1985 Austrian wine poisoning is often a hazy memory to those in Europe and entirely unknown to those outside of it. When asked about it, people will mention the unwitting consumption of hazardous chemicals and a mass public panic, but the details will be muddled or contradictory. Most sources with precise information are left untranslated, and misinformation about the event is commonly repeated through English publications. So what was the Austrian wine poisoning? During the 1980s, Austrian wine had a reputation in Germany as a cheaper alternative to domestic and Italian wines. Often found in grocery stores, these wines were made specifically to meet the high demand for sweetness from German consumers, and the sweetest wines could consistently be priced the highest. The chief difference of Austrian wine, however, was that much of the industry had been arranged for mass production. First, vineyards would leave the grapes on the vine as long as possible, allowing them to ripen. If left for long enough, the producers would gain the legal right to label their bottles as the sweet and lucrative Predikatswein. These ripened grapes would be harvested in late summer and shipped to manufacturers who would ferment the grapes in large vats. The resulting wine would then be transported to bottlers in bulk. The relatively high quality achieved by this process allowed Austrian winemakers to undercut the prices of older, smaller-scale wineries who were more established, and mass production made for a more reliable source of wine. But after years, this production grew from prosperous to suspicious. During the 1970s, the amount of Predikatswein being produced surpassed feasibility, and Austrian investigatory bodies began seeking warrants to test this mass-produced wine in order to discover precisely how these seemingly impossible numbers were being achieved. Without evidence incriminating particular wineries, however, the courts refused to grant these warrants. Even if they could investigate, the Austrian authorities were understaffed and overworked, allowing the wine industry in the country to operate largely unchecked and unsupervised. In one instance, a wine merchant arrived at a cooperative with his tanker to collect wine, but as they were pumping wine into the truck, the man noticed that they had attached a second hose. Investigating further, he found that they were pumping water into the truck as well. Enraged, the man refused to take the wine and approached the Austrian wine control, who told him that they would be unable to begin inquiries for another 6 weeks due to the massive amount of work they already had to perform. Finding this answer unacceptable, he then approached the Ministry of Agriculture, who revealed to him that there were only 18 inspectors tasked with overseeing approximately 60,000 companies. With such a state of affairs, there was little question that adulteration of wine, especially Predikatswein, had become widespread. In 1975, the Chamber of Labor and Employees in Salzburg, Austria, performed both chemical tests and expert taste tests on 76 different bottles of Austrian wine. Of them, only 23 were properly labeled and 56 were defective. But what investigators couldn't have known was precisely how large the problem had grown, or how far winemakers would go to make a profit. On December 21, 1984, an unknown man with a German accent entered the Federal Institute of Agricultural Chemistry in Vienna and placed a bottle full of liquid on the table, declaring that inside of this bottle was the chemical being used to produce such vast quantities of wine. He then exited the building, leaving the bottle on the table. He was never identified. After a month of analysis, chemists were able to determine that the bottle contained numerous chemicals, several of them toxic. Though this tip wasn't enough to investigate any winery in particular, it meant that they knew what tests to apply if given the opportunity, and this would come less than 2 months later. In mid-February of 1985, another tip was sent from someone inside the Austrian wine industry to government officials, a tip that seemed too ridiculous and brazen to be believed. A factory owner was purchasing large amounts of a chemical, one of the chemicals from the mysterious bottle, and attempting to write it off on his taxes as a business expense, claiming that it was all to be used for his small tractor. After inspecting the documents, this blatant discrepancy proved enough to obtain a warrant, and a chemical investigation team was sent. Upon their arrival, they confiscated the wine being stored in the vats and sent samples back to a laboratory. Soon, their suspicions were confirmed. The wine contained significant amounts of diethylene glycol. Diethylene glycol is typically used as a solvent or combined with other chemicals to make numerous liquids such as brake fluid and wallpaper stripper. Its effect on humans, however, is brutal. After ingestion, diethylene glycol enters the bloodstream, where it is transported throughout the body and takes destructive effect in two particular ways. The first, and better understood, is its interaction with the liver and the kidneys. When diethylene glycol enters the liver, it is metabolized into two new chemicals, 2-hydroxyethoxyacetic acid and diglycolic acid. When the latter of these encounters the tubules of the kidneys, it enters the cells and damages the mitochondria, causing necrosis, or literally, cell death. If enough of the kidney is damaged, it can no longer adequately filter toxins out of the blood, a condition called renal failure. This eventually leads to metabolic acidosis, where the blood becomes too acidic for the body to use. The second and more poorly understood effect is that on the nervous system. Through mechanisms apparently still unknown, ingestion of diethylene glycol causes damage to the myelin sheath and axon of nerve cells, making them unable to properly carry electrical signals. Unchecked, this can lead to permanent paralysis, either partial or complete. Studies of people affected by diethylene glycol showed that nearly every single neuron was damaged by the poisoning to some degree. Though the amounts found in this wine were small enough not to cause acute poisoning, long-term consumption can cause the same effects and lead to organ and brain damage. While adding diethylene glycol to wine was unorthodox, the reasons for doing so were easy to glean. Wines with added sugar were worth less, and tests were often performed to make certain that no additives were being used without proper labeling. This meant that, to sweeten wine without reducing profits, another chemical would have to be used, one that was more difficult to detect. Diethylene glycol was poorly understood at the time, the tests for it were rudimentary, and most importantly, it was sweet. In small enough amounts, the effects of poisoning could be minimized while adding a noticeable amount of sweetness, body, and aroma, and if someone did suffer the effects of poisoning, it would be difficult to trace the source back to the wine. By this method, wine cellars could enhance lower quality wine to mimic Prédicat's wine. At the time, the chemical investigation team assumed that this was an isolated incident, limited to cheap, mass-produced wine, but as the weeks progressed, this optimistic assumption proved drastically incorrect. With this wine confiscated, investigators began searching for more wineries who may have performed similar adulteration, but as they did, a parallel incident began occurring across Austria. The bacterial colonies used in sewage treatment facilities were suddenly and inexplicably collapsing, and untreated sewage was flowing into the rivers and devastating their ecosystems. It didn't take long to discover what was causing this. Despite attempts at secrecy, knowledge of the investigations had leaked to the wine industry, and now, other wineries who had been sweetening their wine were desperately dumping it into the sewer to hide it from the investigators. However, the diethylene glycol in the wine had the effect of killing the bacterial colonies in the water treatment plants, and thereby unintentionally broadcasting their actions. Investigators were forced to scramble in order to find these wineries before they could destroy their tainted wine. After raiding a few cellars from winemakers in Burgenland, they quickly discovered that it wasn't only the cheap wine that had been affected. Both cheap and expensive winemakers were adding diethylene glycol to their wines in order to sweeten it. By this point, it was apparent that secrecy was no longer possible. On April 23, 1985, the Austrian government announced the discovery to the public and issued a health warning against Prédicat's wine. 2 days later, approximately 2 million liters of wine were confiscated to await laboratory testing. However, it would take some time for the laboratories, with their limited resources, to finish their tests. Over the following months, these tests would reveal just how deeply this poisoning had rooted itself in the Austrian wine industry, and how it had been exacerbated by ignorant bodies secretly performing their own actions independently. While there was little news over the next few months, those chemists tasked with testing the wine were understaffed, overworked, and woefully disorganized. In some instances, a single sample of wine was tested 100 times due to poor communication, and the number of samples had ballooned so quickly that testing all of the wine became impossible with contemporary methods, with or without proper organization. These chemists also realized that, since the government had announced their investigation, the poisoners now had the opportunity to hide their work by diluting the affected wine before it could be confiscated. And so, the chemists settled on a different plan. They would develop new methods of testing. After only 3 months of dedicated work, they were able to increase the sensitivity of the tests by 4,000% so that 5 milligrams of diethylene glycol could be detected in 1 liter of wine. But perhaps more importantly, these tests could be completed in as little as 5 minutes, making the task of testing much more expedient. Over time, more people in the wine industry were implicated, and their wines were placed on a blacklist. With the revelation of this poisoning, doctors were finally linking illnesses to Austrian wine consumption. On July 11th, multiple cases were reported in the newspapers. One was of a 36-year-old man who had bought 50 bottles of Predikatswein to fill his cellar and decided to drink some of it. That same night, he began suffering from stomach cramps, and his body began shaking. Another man drank a bottle of Predikatswein over the course of a number of evenings, until eventually he started vomiting and suffering from kidney stones. The following day, July 12th, a report was released about a family who had gathered for their 77-year-old grandmother's birthday party, and the 11 adults all shared bottles of Predikatswein. By the next day, each of them was feeling nauseated and dizzy. Another case emerged later that month, which was far more dire. 4 years before the tests for diethylene glycol began, a retired German man had been on vacation near Vienna, where he drank large amounts of sweet wine, then bought another several liters to take back home with him to Munich. During his return journey, however, he began suffering from severe kidney pain and nausea, for which he was admitted to the hospital. There, his condition worsened until finally, his liver failed completely. The doctors were able to deduce the cause of his illness: glycol poisoning, which had come from the large amount of wine he had ingested. The newspapers initially reported him as the first confirmed death of the poisoning, but this was refuted a few days later when the man provided an interview to a competing newspaper, in which he dryly noted, "I am fine now," and recounted his poisoning from 4 years prior. This last report revealed a concerning fact. At first, it was believed that the usage of diethylene glycol was much smaller in scope. This event showed that wineries have been adding the chemical to their wines for over 5 years, and as laboratories continued testing, this scope only widened. The oldest bottle discovered with the chemical was bottled in 1976, meaning that this had been occurring for nearly a decade at the least. Then, on July 19th, it was revealed that a single bottle of ice wine contained 16 grams of diethylene glycol in it, enough to sicken an adult and kill someone susceptible to it. That same day, advertisements appeared in numerous newspapers internationally, purchased by the Austrian Wine Propaganda Office, who were desperate to salvage what public goodwill they could. Fritz Hallgarten, in his book Wine Scandal, translates it so: "No pardon against the black sheep of Austrian viticulture. Criminal investigations have been initiated. Already on April 23, 1985, the authorities took all precautions. All wines found to be adulterated were confiscated. Official report of the Austrian Wine Control. 52,790 Austrian growers, 1,582 Austrian wine merchants, and 52 viticultural cooperatives produce wine under the strictest official control of quality." These statements, however, were obviously hollow to the public, who had grown wary of Austrian wine as new batches were found to include diethylene glycol, and the blacklist continued to grow. As if to rebut the propaganda office, another bottle of wine was found to contain 45 grams of diethylene glycol per liter, almost 3 times as much as the ice wine, only 6 days after they released their advertisement. By the end of July, over 5 million liters of Austrian wine had been confiscated. However, German wine resellers didn't want to lose profits on their imports, and so they silently re-exported their Austrian wine to other countries who were still uninformed about the poisoning. Soon afterward, these countries placed similar bans, but only after numerous drinkers began to show symptoms of paralysis after drinking Austrian wine. In an odd quirk of linguistic barriers, Japan and China also ordered a ban on the sale of Australian wine, due to the similarity of the countries' names. In the course of testing this wine, numerous other scandals were inadvertently discovered, such as the fact that much of the wine market wasn't wine at all, but a special concoction named Kunstwein, which tastes remarkably similar to actual wine, yet contains no grapes. Supposedly, one company was making 100,000 liters of it every month. Around 1980, Kunstwein makers had begun adding diethylene glycol as well. But other scandals were of much more dire consequence, and one explained the devastating effects that some people were experiencing from the glycol. One of the known treatments for diethylene glycol poisoning is ethanol, better known as the alcohol normally found in drinks. Ethanol reacts with the same liver enzymes as diethylene glycol, and if the enzymes are occupied by the ethanol, then the glycol can pass through the liver without being transformed into the toxic diglycolic acid, whereafter it is safely expelled from the body. This meant that, ideally, the ethanol in the wine would help counteract the toxicity of the diethylene glycol, and likely did in many cases. However, the laboratories discovered that some wineries were adding more substances alongside the glycol, most prominently, sugar. Sugar has the opposite effect as ethanol, instead increasing the toxicity of the diethylene glycol and working against whatever safety the ethanol may have provided. As this was being discovered, another newfound scandal was taking place in Germany. After diethylene glycol was found in wines that had been exported, Austrian winemakers claimed that German wine distributors were the ones who must have added the chemical after importing it, despite the clear evidence to the contrary. To refute these claims, the German government tested German wines, surmising that if this adulteration was being performed by these companies, it was unlikely that they would limit it to only Austrian wines. During testing, however, something odd was discovered. Some bottles showed small amounts of diethylene glycol, much smaller than what was in Austrian wines. At first, these German wine distributors suggested that diethylene glycol could occur naturally during fermentation, or perhaps in the pesticides used on the grapes. Chemists quickly refuted these possibilities. Then they attempted to blame the Austrian wines for contaminating their tanks, but these lies were thin. Such contamination would only result in trace amounts of diethylene glycol, not the 20 to 30 milligrams that were appearing in these bottles. The reason was simple and was admitted by multiple sellers. They had secretly been mixing their German wines with Austrian wines to enhance the flavor. In the meantime, the German government blocked 10 billion liters of wine from entering the country any further. But another revelation was perhaps more concerning. Toward the end of July, it was discovered that diethylene glycol had been intentionally added to grape juice at a concentration of 1 gram per liter. While this was less than what was typically found in the affected wines, much less diethylene glycol is required to sicken children, and even if this amount wasn't enough to cause acute poisoning, ingestion over long periods of time could still cause organ and neurological damage, especially without the mitigating effects of ethanol. With vast amounts of information being revealed to the public in such a short time, the media began focusing on this wine adulteration more and more, and affected wine was given a name, Antifreeze Wine, after reporters somewhat inaccurately stated that the chemical being used was antifreeze. While diethylene glycol is used as such in rare cases, other chemicals are far more common for the purpose. Despite this, the name antifreeze wine became the common term. By this point, the scandal had become a major cultural event, and a polka was even created in its honor, Zum Wohl Glykol, or, in English, Cheers to Glycol. With the public enraged, they began to demand answers to 3 questions in particular. How was the government involved? How had this happened in the first place? And why? Reporters began investigating how long the government had known about this adulteration, and they noticed a discrepancy. On May 10th, the Austrian government alerted German officials that contaminated wine had been exported to their country. However, while the German government warned about drinking wine in Austria, the public wasn't informed that wine for sale in Germany had been affected, meaning that German citizens were still unwittingly buying wine with diethylene glycol. What wasn't reported was that, on May 30th, the German wine investigators were ordered to stop taking samples, suggesting that somebody in the upper echelons of the German government wanted this poisoning kept a secret. It wasn't until July 9th, almost a month and a half later, that a warning was given to the public. The reason for these strange occurrences was soon discovered. As opposed to contacting the German federal state, the Austrian investigators informed the Ministry of Viticulture in Mainz, whose chief concern was the well-being of the importers rather than public health. Hoping to salvage the wine, they kept this information secret and sought counsel to discover how much diethylene glycol would be hazardous to a person's health, and planned to approach the Minister of the Federal State for permission to issue new licenses that would allow the sale of Antifreeze Wine. Their plan was to discover the maximum safe amount of the chemical and allow winemakers to mix the affected wine with clean wine to reach this predetermined limit. When this was discovered, the public outcry was massive, and many demanded the resignation of those attempting to allow the sale of the antifreeze wine. 1 month after this revelation, one of the 3 people involved resigned, and the other 2 were transferred to other ministries. But investigators had a more pressing concern: the discovery of how this had happened. The first step was determining likely perpetrators. Using diethylene glycol as an additive seemed almost insidiously genius. Not only did it enhance the flavor profile of the wine in profound ways, but it was also incredibly cheap and could be bought in bulk. What's more, detection had been difficult and time-consuming before the chemist's improvements, making it unlikely to be discovered, especially with the Austrian wine control so overwhelmed. The investigators reasoned that whoever had first conceived of this likely had some sort of background in chemistry. Working off of this assumption, they discovered their prime suspect, a man named Otto Nadrasky. Nadrasky had spent time as a chemist and had later gone on to become a wine consultant for numerous large wine companies. He was promptly arrested, alongside dozens of others. Though many of these people had to be let go due to a lack of evidence, enough were detained that, as court hearings proceeded, the greater reasoning behind the scandal was made clear. During the 1970s, the climate of Austria was changing. Rain had become more frequent and temperatures were gradually rising, which had an effect on the grapes. As mentioned before, farmers wanted to leave grapes on the vine for as long as possible so that they could ripen and sweeten, but the extra rain was making the grapes plump up and fall off of the vine long before the end of the season, resulting in crops that were significantly more sour. In spite of this, production companies still had orders to fill. Many exporters had signed contracts with German importers for large quantities of sweet wine. A solution would have to be found, and so Otto Nadrasky got to work. As a chemist, he had stumbled upon the idea of using diethylene glycol as an additive, and so he experimented to find the correct balance so that the taste could be enhanced while avoiding detection. To aid this endeavor, he also added other chemicals that helped hide its presence and further enhance the taste of the wine. What's more, he discovered that diethylene glycol could hide the presence of added water, which would allow companies to dilute the wine and further increase their yield. Once he had ascertained the proper mixture, he handed the formula to the companies for whom he worked. From there, they sold their secret to other companies, and over the years, more and more wine producers began using this idea until approximately 15% of all Austrian wines had some amount of diethylene glycol in it. Some companies tweaked the formula to add even more glycol. This flippant usage of the chemical may have been due to a misunderstanding. While mass poisonings had occurred in other countries before, the toxicity of diethylene glycol was poorly understood, and in court, multiple wine merchants professed that they had researched diethylene glycol before using it and found no literature to suggest that it was poisonous. Therefore, they felt morally confident adding it to their wine, despite the inherent duplicity. When inspectors learned of this trick, producers frantically tried to hide their affected wine. The federal government had stated the names of the 2 companies that had initially been discovered using glycol, which gave their suppliers time to hide or destroy their wine. Some, as mentioned previously, had dumped theirs into the sewer, but when this only broadcast their usage to the authorities, others realized that something else would have to be done. Wineries began to run their own tests in order to discover whether the equipment could detect the amount of glycol that they were using, hiding the results in neighboring businesses in case they were raided. By their calculations, they would need to dilute the affected wine with 10 parts unaffected wine in order to avoid detection, but this immediately became a problem. None of the wineries had that much unadulterated wine, and there was no way for them to know what other companies had added glycol to their product. If they bought from another winery, they risked making their wines even more toxic and having even more antifreeze wine in their possession. In the end, this proved pointless as the chemists devised their new methods of detection, and many of the culpable parties were arrested. Though court proceedings would take another 12 years, the scandal itself was finally over. But in the meantime, the rest of the wine industry was left to salvage what they could of their livelihoods. Even as countries lifted their bans on Austrian wine, consumer trust had been hopelessly destroyed. The government rushed new and stringent laws through legislation to ensure the safety of the wine and salvage the market, and one economist famously stated that everything would be resolved and forgotten in a year. His optimistic assessment was almost comically wrong. Within weeks of the media coverage, wine merchants were declaring bankruptcy. Even those companies who hadn't participated in the scandal were stigmatized, and Austrian wine was shunned internationally. Of note was that no wine growers had been implicated in the scandal, only fermenters and merchants, and yet many vineyards were forced to close permanently as the Austrian wine economy staggered and they could no longer sell their grapes, especially the lower quality ones. Those merchants who had participated, however, were indignant, and one defense lawyer blamed consumers for buying cheap wine without more careful consideration. These defenses proved ineffective, and many were given the maximum 10-year sentence. In the end, Austrian wine exports were down to less than 5% of where they had been only 1 year prior. Despite this, some of the companies at the center of the scandal managed to avoid bankruptcy. According to official records, nobody had been injured by the glycol, but this seems unlikely given the scope of the poisoning. In the meantime, the Austrian government was now left with the daunting task of destroying 270 million liters of contaminated wine, and their answer came from surprising sources: an electric power plant and a cement plant. In 1987, it was announced that technicians from the Österreichischen Traukraftwerke in Carinthia had devised a method for burning the wine to produce electricity. Similarly, a cement plant had retrofitted their furnaces to permit the use of wine as a coolant, and in this manner, all of the wine was gradually destroyed. With the poisoning concluded, the country set about rebuilding their industry. Winemakers began a campaign to resist the harsh new quality control laws enacted by the government, arguing that the scandal wasn't caused by weak laws, but rather by a lack of enforcement. After they couldn't come to an agreement with lawmakers, multiple irate farmers threw salads at Günther Hayden, the agriculture minister. Still, the wine laws held. While the export market had been annihilated, the domestic market had survived, with sales somewhere between 90 to 94% compared to the previous year. This may largely be credited to the dedicated buyers of particular wineries, as well as the still thriving tourism industry. With the image of sweet wine tainted, wineries focused on cultivating grapes to make dry white wines, while wineries worked on reviving old, traditional Austrian methods of production. Those winemakers who survived the scandal began taking even greater pride in their product, focusing on improving the quality as opposed to the quantity. This was encouraged by new wine colleges established across Austria with the express purpose of educating aspiring vintners. These colleges were tasked with educating and guiding a new generation of winemakers and merchants who embraced a wide variety of new ideas, adapting quickly to the changing tastes of consumers and enacting more sustainable growing practices, leading to the long-term positive health of wineries. For example, some new wine growers used a practice called Traubenausdünnung, where they would remove 50 to 70% of the grapes from the vine so that the remaining ones would receive more of the plant's nutrients and energy. While this resulted in less wine overall and was labor-intensive, the resulting product was of notably higher quality. The scandal had also encouraged consumers to be more conscious of their purchases, and they began to take a greater interest in both the production process and the quality of the wine they were drinking, which in turn demanded a greater knowledge from producers and merchants. With time, and with the new winery practices, drinkers began to buy wine in greater amounts once again. This was bolstered by the confidence instilled by the new, stringent government policies. Every new bottle would be tested for composition and quality, and would be marked as approved with an excise stamp that included an identification number and date of inspection. It would be 16 years before the export market reached the levels of profit they once had, but by the time they did, their reputation had been radically altered. Though the modern Austrian wine market is much smaller than those of other countries such as Italy and France, they are renowned for their quality, and they are instantly recognizable thanks to the newly designed, distinctive red-white-red excise stamp on top of every bottle that signifies it as approved for export by the federal government after both chemical tests and a taste test. Inadvertently, the stamps had become a marketing tool. Today, the wine scandal is seemingly forgotten, replaced by modern acknowledgement of the universally high Austrian quality and enforced by what are often agreed to be the strictest wine laws in the world. Some winemakers still grumble about the brash stupidity of the old wine merchants who added diethylene glycol to their wine, but all will agree that, if the poisoning had never happened, Austrian wine would be drastically different, and most seem thankful for the prosperity that the modern wine industry is enjoying, with no need for added glycol.